I just first timed Ambessa jungle and got yelled at by my Camille top, even though I was the sole reason we were winning fights. I mean, people tend not to like other people first timing things in ranked. You kind of got to, though. I mean, how else are you going to learn it, right? But, yeah. What's Ambessa's day one win rate? What's she looking like? It's got to be like, I'm guessing 36%. That's my guess. That's my guess, everybody. 36% day one win rate. Oh! 41. That's not bad. She might be strong. If she's starting day one at 41%, I could see her definitely... I could see this climbing a decent amount. This is close, though. Like, I don't think this is like a red flag. Like, oh no, she's broken. I would expect her to start around 40. I expected a bit lower, but like anywhere around 40 on day one is probably like... She is... My guess is that, looking at this, my guess would be she is in the realm of balanced, at least initially speaking, for the first like 2 weeks, and possibly might even be strong. I'm not sure though. Like obviously you never know with day one stuff. This could go up to 57 tomorrow. It's not going to go up to 57 tomorrow, but like, you know, day one stuff's very unreliable, but usually when you see like a hard to play character come out, they usually start around 40% win rate if they're like really, really hard to play. And then a few characters will start way lower. Like wasn't Briar 38? Briar was like 34 or something. Briar was giga low because if you don't know how to play Briar, you will literally die, right? Whereas that's not the case with a lot of other characters. So Briar, the 4 characters in League of Legends that came out with the lowest win rates are Briar. She was like down at 34. Yuumi. I think Yuumi started super, super insanely low too, somewhere around 34. Yasuo started at like 35, 36. And there's one more. And this is the lowest champion ever released. This character was super, super giga weak on release. Does anybody know what the last one was? The lowest win rate champion ever made on release, specifically on the day one. Someone's saying it's Aphelios, someone's saying it's Ivern, it's Ornn, it's Aesol. Y'all are not even close. Ah, there we go. Rancor's got it. Syndra. It was Syndra. Syndra came out at a 30% win rate. And that was due to a combination of being very, 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 very weak, but also being very, very bugged. So Syndra had a combination of general weakness combined with bugs that made her even harder to win on. And I believe she came out at like 30 or 32. It was like... She was so low that at the time, like some designers were asking like, hey, what's the win rate of a 4v5? Because it was like, she was so low that it was kind of like, is it almost as bad as just not having a person on your team? Like, would it be better to just not have a person on your team? But yeah, she was very weak on release. How hard is it to balance perma scaling mechanics on champs like Smolder, Sign, and Nasus? That's a great question. So I think it depends on the character, of course. But I think the thing really about them is you kind of like has to ask the question of like what they, what's the counterbalance to them. So like as an example, Nasus's perma scaling is counterbalanced by 2 things. Number 1 is he's not guaranteed to scale because he has a weak laning phase. And so Nasus is not safe in lane nor particularly strong in lane a lot of the time. We'll ignore some of the recent Nasus mid stuff, but like, generally it's not a guarantee that Nasus is going to get ahead to begin with. And then eventually he will and he'll beat the crap out of you. But then also his other weakness is that late game he is Nasus. And so Nasus could have a billion stacks and he might not even be able to hit you with his Q. Right? And so that's kind of a thing where it's like Nasus is going to giga scale, but he has some things that are always going to be true about how like weak about him that make that scaling a bit more okay. One of the things that we made very sure of on Senna, because she's a perma scaling AD carry, is regardless of how she's doing, because her attack speed ratio and whatnot is just kind of on the lower end, can Senna scale? Yes. Can she scale really hard? Yes. But in most games of League of Legends, Senna, in terms of being a DPS threat as an AD carry, is, on the lower end of a DPS AD carry could achieve. And so even though she is infinitely scaling, there's going to be a lot of games where she's still not necessarily going to be able to out DPS, say, a Kai'Sa until much, much, much later, right? And so one of the things that keeps Senna in line with her infinite scaling is, despite having it, it doesn't necessarily make her a god tier DPS champion until much later, because she attacks slower, things like that. So that's like something about her. Vhagar is limited with his infinite scaling, because no matter how hard he scales, his ultimate has a cooldown. And that actually really, really matters, because it means no matter how crazy that Vhagar is, a lot of his power is locked behind something that will go on cooldown. Which means it's going to be a lot harder for him to one-shot the second guy in the fight. And so basically, it's kind of like a thing where it's like a lot of infinite scalers do scale infinitely, but they still have like core weaknesses on their kit that like their infinite scaling isn't going to be able to get around. I think is the thing to think about, is the thing to like. And so it's like, hey, you scaled to the moon, but what can't you do? And then if the case of infinite scaling is something like, say, Kael's not an infinite scaler, but like, and I know she doesn't feel very strong right now, but there's been a lot of metas where Kael's like literally one of the best late game characters you can have, right? And in the case of that, the weakness is you're bad in lane, right? And so if you've got a scaling character who kind of transcends to having few weaknesses, which is often the case for Kael, perhaps not right now though, a lot of people say her late game feels pretty weak right now, but it's often the case for the Kael where she can transcend to the point of not having very few weaknesses. Then there's a question of how you got there, right? Which is like, okay, well, if your character ends up with very few weaknesses, they probably need to have like, maybe just be a lot weaker early or something like that. And I think where it can get really dangerous in terms of infinite scalers, and I think sometimes we see this on Smolder, is where an infinite scaler is able to prevent loss while still being likely to scale. So I think some metas with Smolder at some tunings, one of the things that Smolder can do that I think can be a little difficult is he'll basically say, I'm weak early in terms of I won't kill you, but you can't necessarily stop me from farming and scaling. And then when I do, I'm going to be kind of a monster, right? He's often able to like, historically in certain metas and stuff, he was able to like wash the lane. This is something that Kai'Sa had a lot of problems with on release. Kai'Sa on release, after we buffed her, had a period of time where she was like one of the best scaling AD carries, but she was also one of the best AD carries at washing the lane and guaranteeing she would scale. And so she would often just be like, well, it doesn't matter if you can beat me, I'm just going to use my Q to farm everything and I'll be fine. And so if your character is just going to be a really, really good scaler into the late game, there generally needs to be some ability to like stop them from scaling. And so or again, alternately, even if they scale, there's like some core weakness. One of the things I tried to put on Senna, and you can argue if it's good or bad, is I wanted to make sure that like her scaling was attached to souls, which a decent amount is like taking them from opponents, right? Like what we could have done with Senna is we could have said, hey, you get a lot of souls from minions and that's it. Just the same as Thresh, right? Like, so Thresh doesn't have to whack his opponents to get souls, right? But it actually felt fairly important that half of Senna's scaling, or some amount of Senna's scaling, is through auto-attacking her opponents. And the reason for that is it puts pressure on Senna to be doing well. And it means that if you're dominating a Senna player, like if you're like saying like, hey, Senna, we've zoned you off the wave, or hey, Senna, we've killed you repeatedly, that Senna will fall behind in her scaling. Because she needs to be attacking you to be at the same level in terms of the soul stack she has.